card 16. So this question is all about percentages and knowing what to do when you are faced with multiple percentages in a row. Okay, so for this problem, it's very important that you understand percentages. So if you haven't covered it in class, then you should definitely have your math teacher explain, the basics of percentages to you because it's very complicated. But I'm going to show you how to solve it if you already have an understanding of percentages. So we're going to say that Karen started out with 100% of her comic book collection. Okay, so number 1, that's the beginning of the problem. Before we get started selling, she has 100% of a comic book collection. Now, the first sentence says that Karen sold 10% of her collection. So number 2, what's left from 100% if we sell 10%? Well, we're left with 90% of her original comic book collection. Right? So 100% minus 10% is 90% of her comic book collection. Now, Karen later sold 10% of the remaining collection. So now we're selling 10% of this amount, of this 90%. So there's a few ways to go about finding 10% of 90%. You may know it, which is great. And if you don't, I like to rewrite percentages as the number over 100. That's how you rewrite a percentage. 10% means 10 out of 100. So if we're looking for 10% of 90%, that's what that math equation is going to look like. This means 10% of 90%. So right now we're looking for what that 10% of 90% is to subtract away from it. So we can do that by solving this problem. 10% of 90%. Of means multiply. So how are we going to solve this? When you multiply fractions, you go straight across top and bottom. 90 times 10 is 900 because you're just multiplying by 10, so you're just adding a 0. And now 100 times 100 is going to be 1, and then with 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. Okay? And now let's solve this. We can subtract away zeros that are on top and bottom. And we're left with 9 over 100. Okay, and if you remember what I said originally, 10 over 100 means 10%. So 9 over 100 actually means 9%. Percent just means over 100. Any of you who take a language, you might recognize CENT. Cent means 100 in French. So 9%. So that means 10% of 90% is 9%. So if we get rid of that last 9%, what are we left with? 90 minus 9 is 81%. So after selling that first 10%, we had 90. And then after selling that next 10% of the 90%, which equals 9%, we are left with 81%. Okay? And that is actually the final step. That is the percent of her original collection that she now has. So anytime you are dealt a word problem that deals with percentages and no specific numbers, just plug in 100% and then work down from there until you get to your final step.